So let me just do a very quick round of introductions and make sure I've got my notes in hand. So starting from my right, Mike Norton, Professor Mike Norton, who is also a member of the Harvard Behavioural Insights Group, an Associate Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. He tells me, and I read here, that he has a BA in Psychology and English. So at last we have somebody on stage with the right qualifications. Speaking as somebody whose first degree was in English literature, which always seems to me to be a good place to start. So that's fantastic. He's also a fellow of the MIT Media Lab and MIT's Sloan School of Management, which again I think will be an interesting dimension. Mia Garlick on my right is currently the head of policy for Facebook in Australia and New Zealand. And prior to that, she was the Assistant Secretary for Digital Economy and Convergence Strategy at the Department of Broadband Communications and Digital Economy, which we always used to know as DBCDE. I always had a plan to change the word department to agency so that this could be an agency of ABCDE, but I never got that idea up. Mia joined the department from a stint in Silicon Valley, where she worked as the product counsel for YouTube and as a general counsel for the non-profit Creative Commons. A very interesting background, I'm sure you'll agree, and Mia and I met some years ago on the now, I think mostly famous, but occasionally infamous Government 2.0 task force. On my left, Gautam Jaggi, who leads the development of life sciences for EY, and very much leading in their thought leadership program. He's also the lead analyst for life sciences within EY's knowledge group. And finally, Jack Dan. Some of you will have seen and met Jack, obviously, yesterday formally at the reception. Jack is the National General Manager for Government at Telstra, one of our major sponsors as well. He leads Telstra's premier research and thought leadership program called Connected Government. Works with the OECD and other leading international organisations developing new research into government productivity, policy development and service delivery. So that's our panel. It's a great collection of minds and perspectives, I think, on this conversation. And with pretty much not much further ado, we're going to kick off with Mike, and we're going to kind of run left to right. And then, as I say, we'll open it up for questions. So plenty of note-taking, hit the Twitter feed, and we'll keep an eye on how that goes as well. Mike Norton, thank you.
Thank you. So it's great to be here and chat with everybody over the last 2 days. And I think our job is to talk about nudges in business in particular. But I wanted to focus on one of the things that I really try to do in my research is look not only at how do we nudge people to engage in a behavior, that's kind of the time one thing, how do we get people to do X? But because I'm a psychologist, I also want to look at after that time. And what I really try to look at is the psychological outcome of having gotten people to engage in X. So you can imagine that some nudges will cause people to engage in some behavior, and having done it, they're not very happy about it. Now, we might still be happy that they engage in the behavior, but it's not a terrific outcome if they're not happy about it, especially as we think about the behavior going forward. Much better is if we can design nudges where not only do people engage in the behavior that we'd like them to or that they would like to themselves, but that after they do it, actually they're happy about it, that their well-being has improved or they express more satisfaction. And we can do this in any domain. So we can do it when we do nudges with employees. We can think about what are the new kinds of incentives we can give employees that not only will they take them up, but having done them, they'll be happier with the company, they'll work harder, and they'll want to do more in the future. We can do it with customers, where we think about what are nudges we can use with customers, where not only will they, again, engage in the behavior we want, but having done it, they'll actually say, thanks for allowing me to do that. I'd like to keep coming back. And we can also do it with government, where we think about if we get people to engage in some behavior, and having done it, are they happy with the government for having them do that, or are they saying, I really wish that you hadn't gotten me to do that? So I'm just going to talk about a couple of projects in each of those streams briefly, with thinking about employees, thinking about customers, and then briefly thinking about with citizens engaging in behavior, in particular paying taxes. So you can imagine that if we get people to pay taxes, we're happy because they paid, but maybe they're not so happy that they paid. So I'll talk about that at the very end. So with employees, so a lot of the research that I do actually focuses on the relationship between money and happiness. And it turns out that most of the things that we think about that relationship are completely wrong, which is kind of a bummer because we spend a lot of time trying to make money and we spend a lot of our time thinking about our happiness, but they don't necessarily always work in the way we want. And in particular, what we see in our data and in other people's data is that the amount of money that you make doesn't matter that much for your happiness. So after you reach a certain level of income, in the US it's around $75,000 a year, it turns out more money doesn't make you that much happier. The size of your house has no relationship to how happy you are with your life overall. I know a lot of you spend a lot of money on your house or apartment, so that's a little disturbing, but it's true. How nice your car is has no relationship to how happy you are with your life overall. I know that's also disturbing because probably some of you have a car you like a lot. By the way, how nice your car and your house are have a lot to do with how much you like your car and your house. It's just that they don't seem to do much for us overall. So if you think about these things as kind of business as usual, we usually get money, we're trying to get more money for ourselves, and it doesn't seem to do that much for us. And when we get that money, we tend to buy stuff like houses and cars and coffees and TVs, and that doesn't do that much for us either. So our basic insight was if people are kind of focused on money and using it to buy things that don't make them happy, is there anything they could do with it instead that might make them a little bit happier than the way they usually use it? And we do experiments kind of to show that people can benefit, and then we roll those insights out into companies to see if companies can benefit. So in an experiment that we did quite a few years ago now, we actually thought, I wonder if it's the case that if spending on yourself all the time, that's the houses and TVs, doesn't make you happy, maybe if you do something else with the money, like instead of on yourself all the time, you give it to other people, maybe that might actually lead to more happiness. We did experiments where we literally gave people money. So you guys would get $20 to spend on yourselves. You guys would get $20 to spend on somebody else. We tell you to go out and spend it, and then we call you up at night and we say, how do you feel? And what'd you do with the money? We're just ranking. What's better to do with your money? Spend it on yourself or spend it on somebody else? We did this experiment with undergrads, and I can tell you, we gave money to undergrads in the morning, and we said, spend it on yourself on whatever you want. And other undergrads, we said, spend it on somebody else, whatever you want. What do you think happens when you give an undergraduate $5 first thing in the morning? Coffee. Massive, like streaming towards Starbucks to get a coffee, basically, with the free money. The only difference was some people went to Starbucks with the $5 and got a coffee for themselves. Other people went to Starbucks and got a coffee and gave it to somebody else. Now you could think, well, how could it be better to not have the coffee? Coffee's great, but it turns out at the end of the day, people are happier when they when they gave the coffee away rather than when they drank the coffee themselves. And we see it time and time again. There's this basic relationship between giving and happiness that just doesn't seem to be there when we spend on ourselves. Sorry to make you guys the selfish people and you the nice people, but I looked at the bios and I'm pretty sure actually you are the bad people and you're the nice people over there. Anyway, so that's a basic kind of finding. So we say, oh, that's interesting. People get happy when they spend on other people. What does that mean for businesses? So think about how we could use that. So now we know that when people spend on themselves, it's not bad, but it doesn't do that much for them. But when they spend on somebody else, it does something for them and makes them happy. Think about how we usually incentivize employees. We give them salaries and bonuses that are for themselves, and they use it usually on themselves. Nothing wrong with that, and those can be very effective. But what if we gave employees a bonus, given what we now know, that they had to spend on somebody else instead? Maybe it would have a bigger impact because we've shown that it might actually make them happier. So in an experiment that we did actually with, one of them that we did with some sales reps in Belgium, we had sales teams of, they're actually all men at this company, so I can actually say salesmen. These are sort of serious Belgian men in their 40s in black suits is how you should picture them. And some of them, one week, we said, here's the equivalent of $20 to spend on yourself. Do whatever you want with it. And other people, we said, here's $20, but you got to spend it on someone on your sales team. These people work in teams when they sell. I have to tell you, we learned a couple of things. First off, people do not appreciate receiving a $20 bonus when they make a lot of money. It feels like an insult. So that was a problem. But what was weird was when we gave them $20 to spend on somebody else, it didn't seem like a small amount of money. It's the same amount of money, but when you get $20 for yourself, you compare it to everything you have. When you get $20 for somebody else, it's like it's a different account. Literally, it's compared to nothing, $20 is actually a lot. But the second learning that we figured out is that these guys did not want to do this. So they said, look, I'm busy, I don't have time to buy, what's a stereotypically Belgian name? I'm not sure. Luke. I don't have time to buy Luke anything this week, so why do I have to do this? Their manager made them do it, and as soon as they were forced to do it, they loved it. They bought all kinds of ridiculous things for each other. The funniest thing they bought was one guy bought a piñata. brought it into the sale. Remember now, serious Belgian men in their 40s, black suits, bought a pinata, strung it up, they smashed it, the candy came out, and they ate the candy. Now we look at, so first off, as an intervention, as an HR intervention, this one was nothing really happening, and this one was really fun things happen. And most importantly, it felt like it came from them instead of the organization saying, now you have to go do a team building exercise. They felt like they had the flexibility to do it themselves. What we see over time is that these teams that got money for themselves, nothing changes in their behavior. It's basically $20 to them and nothing happens. The teams that we gave money to spend on each other, they actually sell better. They become a better team over time. And we've seen this actually in a bunch of we did it with, of all things, dodgeball teams as well. We can see the dodgeball teams get better at playing. Do you know what dodgeball is? It's the dumbest game in the history of the world. Let me describe it for you if you're not familiar. You throw a ball and the other people try to dodge it. And if you hit them, they're out. I think it's the simplest game that we've ever, maybe simple isn't the right word, dumbest game we've ever invented as humans. It turns out, though, that when team members spend on each other, they do better than when we give them money and to spend on themselves. So we see again and again that we have an impact of this kind of pro-social giving, as we call it, and very little impact of giving people bonuses as usual. That's the employee context. Now think about the customer context. How can we change the way customers interact with a company so that we built this insight of giving to others in as well? We did a field experiment with Crate & Barrel, which is a furniture and home goods store, and a nonprofit in the US called DonorsChoose.org, which is a website where public school teachers can post projects for things that they need for their classroom. They're mainly from low-income schools. So they're basically saying, I don't have enough money to do X that I'd like to do with my students. It could be, we want to teach people Mark Twain. It could be, I want people to play this instrument. It could be, we need art supplies to teach painting. And you and I could go on the website and buy those things for the students right now. The teacher writes you a thank you note saying thanks for sending them, and the students write you thank you notes saying the stuff was awesome. I gave, and a kid wrote me and said, literally, I'm quoting, thanks for the science stuff. Experiments are cool. Which if you're a nerd like me is like crack, basically, to hear a little kid say that. It's a very, very powerful site for a lot of reasons. So what do we do with Crate & Barrel? Crate & Barrel does a lot of corporate social responsibility activities, but they also do a lot of marketing as usual. I'm in marketing, so we send coupons and discounts and buy two, get one free and all those things. We did an experiment where some customers got the regular marketing stuff, like I keep making you guys the regular people, sorry. Some customers got the regular marketing stuff, like buy two, get one free. Other customers got a DonorsChoose.org gift card that said, thanks for being our customer, here's $50 to give to any classroom you want. We give the equivalent over here, here's $50 off your next purchase, let's say. Then we look to see who comes, first off we look at redemption. So redemption, click-through, open rate, redemption, any of the marketing things we care about, as you can imagine, enormously higher on the Donors Choose gift card than on business as usual. Redemption rate much, much higher as well. But when we look at sales in the ensuing 6 months, people are more likely to come back to the website when they got the Donors Choose gift card than when they got business as usual. Again, we have this basic insight that spending on others does something different than business as usual for yourself, and we can see it playing out with customers as well. Last thing that I'll talk about, we've tried to build this same idea into the hardest problem, I think, one of the hardest problems, I think, in the world, which is not just getting people to pay their taxes, which is an incredibly difficult problem, but actually getting people to like it, which is an even harder problem, I think. It's very difficult to feel lovely about writing a check to the government, even in Scandinavian countries where people are a little bit more favorable toward taxes. Still, the moment of the payment is usually not that amazing of a moment. So we thought, well, now we know that with regular people, they get happy. With employees and with customers, something good happens when they give to others. Is there a way to make taxes feel more like that, more like you're actually giving to somebody else? In some experiments that we've done, we do a very simple intervention. We just have some people pay taxes as usual. We have other people, we design an intervention where they kind of get to feel like they're sending their taxes where they want them to go. And it's a little bit like DonorsChoose.org. So with DonorsChoose.org, if I care about music, I can buy musical instruments for some students. But if I care about physics, I can buy whatever physics equipment is and send that to students. And if I care about math, I can buy that. And if I care about literature, I can send books. Think about that same concept, but applied to government, where you can actually think about where your money is going. And it feels less like the government stealing from you and more like you're giving to things that you care about. We did a lab experiment where we had some people who we basically made them work for wages, and then we said, surprise, we're going to tax you at 30% of your income. Did not go over very well, I'll tell you that right now. Not so unlike the real world, though. Some people we just said, you have to pay us. Other people we said, before you pay us, tell us where you'd like your taxes to go. And we gave them some options for the lab. These are people who come to our lab a lot and do our experiments. So we said, you could allocate the money to better snacks, or to better computer screens, or to better music, or all sorts of other categories that they could allocate it to. And then we said, now it's time to pay your taxes. Put them in this envelope that's anonymous and hand them in. We secretly know whether you actually paid your taxes or not. We're basically letting you cheat on your taxes. People who we just say, too bad there's taxes, pay us, they cheat like crazy. It's kind of a bummer. People just totally rob us blind. People who we let tell us where they want their taxes to go cheat much, much less. They're much more likely to pay the full amount to us. Now, when we do the same thing at a national level, we can ask people, here's all the tax categories. Where would you like your taxes to go if it were up to you? And we let people express, oh, I'd like them to go here, I'd like them to go here. And what we see that when we let people do that, again, they're happier to pay their taxes. Now we're actually trying to roll out a field experiment where we test this in the field to try to say, if we really let people tell us where they would like their taxes to go, are they more likely to comply? And I just want to say one final thing. You could imagine that if we let people say where they want their taxes to go, that government would grind to a halt immediately because no one would pay for things like roads because they're boring, right? So in fact, so you can see people giving enormous sums of money to things that they like. So the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States is an organization that basically funds public art. And the percent of the budget is something, I don't know, but it's 0.01% or something very tiny. Liberals in our sample, people who care about the arts, let's say on average, they give like 10% of all taxes to this foundation, which would be like trillions of dollars for art, which is crazy. The funny thing is actually conservatives who are not a fan of this organization, they want to give it only like 1% because they don't understand how little it gets now. But anyway. So what we can see is, first off, that people still give money to the things that we want them to. So it's not as though the country would shut down, but we can actually also see that even just letting them express their opinion, even if it's not binding, just saying we actually care about where you want your taxes to go, has almost as big an effect as letting them decide where they want to go. Again, we're trying to change taxes from this onerous, you have to do this, to, in a sense, it's like giving again, where I get to say where I want my money to go, and we can see if that actually helps people. So, of course, we have other projects as well, but this is one area where we have this very basic, this is what we try to do in our research, this very basic insight that some behavior makes people happier. Then we try to think of things we want our employees, our customers, or our citizens to do that we can build that insight into, such that when they engage in that behavior, we can shift it from something that maybe they didn't want to do to not only, again, nudging them to do it, which is an incredibly important problem in and of itself, but having done it, actually experience it positively, make them more likely to do it in the future, make them less likely to have sort of negative reactants. And it's not tricking them, as Cass said earlier, it's full information. They don't have to do it if they don't want. But we find that people really like to do it when it feels like giving. And in the end, it has a much better emotional impact. I think with that, I'll stop and turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That's great. Okay. That's a start. So let's keep going. Mia, all yours.
Cool. Well, thanks very much for having me. I wanted to talk about two different sort of angles. One is looking internal at Facebook in terms of how we look at data and A/B testing to try to achieve our mission and to build really great services that people like to use. And then the second part is just talking about two different projects that we've sort of seen where we've tried to sort of iterate and drive pro-social actions. So we're a mission-driven company. The mission is to make the world more open and connected. We're also a data-driven company, so we're always looking at what the data is telling us in terms of how that is helping us realize our mission. And so we really expect everyone at Facebook to be focused on that. One of the sort of things that we're trying to do is, in terms of achieving the mission, we like to talk about it as a culture and a management approach that adopts what we call the hacker way. We think there is tremendous value in enabling everyone in the world to be able to connect and share in real time at scale. And I just put up this slide from McKinsey & Co. because it's McKinsey & Co. Of course, they come up with a really, really, really big number, but they also found that social technology could add about 900 billion to 1.3 trillion in value to the global economy. And that's really just that, nature of real-time information flows. So whether that's getting, real-time feedback from customers, so rather than waiting for sales to drop off and waiting for having to do a bunch of focus groups that can take months and months, people could post a comment on your Facebook page, it could get 100,000 likes, and all of a sudden you have a live issue, to also just having information flows within an organization. And so that's really what we're constantly trying to do, is really improve those information flows and that ability for people to connect and share at scale. And the internal approach that we adopt is, as I mentioned, the hacker way approach. Now, traditionally, I think the word hacker had quite a negative connotation. It's, that sort of creepy teenage person who's sitting there trying to do bad things to your computer. Let me just take that off so I stop buzzing. But it actually is less about sort of the bad person trying to do bad things to your computer and more to do with an approach. So it's about believing that you can always do something better. Always trying to not believe anything is ever really finished and done. Which is why at Facebook we have the motto that done is better than perfect, and also that we're only 1% done. I mean, the company has been around for 10 years now. There's 1.28 billion people who regularly connect and share on the site, but still we feel that our mission is 1% done. Thanks, cool. Can I do that? Yeah, cool. And so part of that is also about just letting things go out, even if they're not perfect, just so that we can see what the reaction is. And that leads us to also then, instead of having arguments saying, well, how are people going to react? Are people going to like this? We actually just put it out and we A/B test it to see what the reaction is, and then we use the data to solve the argument. And to try to sort of help build us with that, we actually just open sourced one of the A/B testing kits that we use across the site, and it's now up on GitHub. And so the goal of that is just to help more people go through and use data and A/B testing in order to drive improvements in product and iterate on the site. Just going on to two of the examples that I wanted to use. So one is about Facebook and elections and voter turnout. In the 2010 US congressional elections, we actually worked with some researchers to try to really nail down the extent to which a social platform like Facebook and the extent to which the social influence of friends could drive real-world actions. So on Facebook, we like to talk a lot about sort of the power of friends and about social feedback. On Facebook, we talk about having a real name culture. A real name culture is essentially that most people are who they say they are on the site. It's very difficult for me to pretend to be a male surfer because on the weekend I post up photos of myself at the park with my kids. And so when I'm posting articles about things that I'm doing or about causes I believe in or about articles that I've read, my friends and family tend to know it's what I really think because it is actually connected with my real identity. And then if you connect that in with the fact that you're connecting with your friends and family when you're sharing the information, we were looking at that as the social feedback, which is what this project was looking at. What the researchers did is they used around 61 million people who are actively connecting on the site, and they broke them out into 3 different control groups. The first group just saw hey, today's the election, here's how you get information about how to go and vote. The next group saw it's the election, here's how you get information about how to go and vote. And by the way, here are the profile pictures of 6 of your friends who've just gone and voted. And then the last group got no message. And the story, otherwise I wouldn't be on the panel, of course, is that the group that saw the message with the 6 profiles of their friends were more likely to vote, more likely to engage. And it wasn't just the direct impact in terms of people going to vote and saying that they'd voted. It was also all of their friends and family who then saw that they had said that. And so it quadrupled the impact of the message in terms of driving hundreds of thousands more people out to the polls based on the ability to match with publicly available voter records.
records. Unfortunately, this was something we tried to look at in Australia with the election, but the voter records are held a bit differently, and so we weren't able to look at whether we could replicate that here in Australia, but it's still a very powerful study from the US. And it's something that then we have worked on to now release sort of globally as a tool that we're going to have on the site. This is the imagery from the recent Indian elections, where 4 million people clicked and used the iVoter button on the site. And given the population size of India, you can imagine then the quadrupling effect through from having that. And we're also looking to use that in the upcoming New Zealand elections. The last thing I want to talk about was our compassion research project. So we partnered with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence to try to build some more compassion into the tools that we have available on the site to help people solve conflicts. On Facebook, you have the rules that say you can and can't, post certain things on the site, and then if people see things that they don't like or that they think violate the rules, they report that to us, and then we review it and we remove the things that violate the community standards. So that's sort of, one solution is someone posts up hate speech or they post up nudity, and then we remove it. But when you have 1.28 billion people on the platform, a lot of times people are going to have problems with content that they see. They're going to have conflicts on the site, and leaving a piece of content up or down isn't going to solve the conflict that they're experiencing. The way this sort of came to our attention was we found that a large number of people were reporting photographs that did not violate our terms, but which they were in, and we realised that what this was about was people just, it's the bad party photo, it's the unflattering photo that you really wish wasn't up online for everyone to see. So we started to give people more options. Rather than just report to Facebook, we said, do you want to message the person? Do you want to block the person? Do you want to unfriend the person? And increasingly, people wanted to message the person. And then we started adding some text. So rather than just say, do you want to send your friend who posted this photo a message, we started to put emotion-rich text and language in there to say, hey, there's this photo that you've posted and I don't like it. Could you please remove it? And the more emotion that we put into the flow, the more people used it and the happier that people felt. And I think this sort of flies a lot in the face of a lot of product design. So, typically in an online product design situation, you've sort of been trained, have as few click-throughs as possible because there will always be drop-off. But what we found with the compassion research is we were adding more emotion-rich language, more options, more click-throughs, and people were reporting a better and better experience each time. When we asked people how they felt at the end of the experience, this sort of taps into a little bit of what you're talking about earlier, people just felt better for having the conversation. A large proportion, 85% of people did remove the photo, but even where people didn't, both sides felt better for having had that conversation because they understood the other person's point of view. And so I think that's just a way of thinking about the flows as well. So I just wanted to leave it with this slide, which is my favorite slide. I think sometimes it's hard to think about what is social media and what is Facebook. This is a map of all the friendship connections globally around the world on Facebook. And I think it's fantastic to, when you're thinking about behavioural insights, to also be thinking about what happens when you can globally connect the world at scale in real time.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mia. That's fantastic. And a lovely, it's an interesting reminder of the world that is beginning to, and presumably that will start glowing in all sorts of different places in all sorts of different ways. There's the clicker. Gautam, it's all yours.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to talk, my sort of angle is healthcare, and I'm going to talk specifically about that application of behavioral economics. And I think it's sort of an interesting case study because a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of the topics and some of the summary you offered up earlier today, some of the issues that have come up, I think there's an interesting thing to look at when you look at healthcare and look at where healthcare is moving at this particular point in time and what that's doing to incentives, what that is doing to businesses and the behavior of businesses in that sector, right? So, if you think about, here we go, all right. Some of the issues that have come up, one is sort of this thing about, okay, low-hanging fruit versus big picture, and I think healthcare, and I'll walk you through some of the numbers in a minute, is probably, you could argue, the biggest of the big picture opportunities. It's a huge opportunity, and related to that, there's some interesting things that are happening. The second sort of question that sort of resonated for me from earlier today was, how do we get businesses to sort of use behavioral economics more and use BI more and use it to do the right thing? And we were talking about things like corporate social responsibility. I think it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of these same biases that we're talking about have been used against us. There's a statistic that came up earlier in this conference, and it's come up a number of times, that advertising since the 1920s has been using these biases against us, has been basically using the same biases to get us to make bad decisions. You could take that more broadly and look at a lot of companies, and it's, whether you look at retail companies, you look at, I don't want to single anyone out, but, food, a lot of businesses are designed, and this is not a bug, it's a feature, it's a feature of the system, that you'll make more money if you can get people to make decisions that get them to spend more, often unwisely, often on things that aren't good for their health, aren't good for their financial well-being, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the way the system is designed, because that's, as a company, ultimately your responsibility is to your shareholders, and this is how you make more money for your shareholders. And what's exciting about health, and I'll get to this in a minute, is I think those incentives are now flipping. That in healthcare, you have for the first time incentives that are actually getting companies to make more money by quote unquote doing the right thing. That it's not just doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, it's doing the right thing for business. It's actually good for the bottom line, right? And to put some context around this, let's think about all of human history and just step back 30,000 feet in the air. And if I can simplify a little bit, there have been two major advances in health outcomes over all of human history. The first was improved hygiene, which was a huge leap forward. Relatively simple things, clean water, clean hands, but led to huge reductions in post-infection, post-surgery infection, survival rates, et cetera, et cetera. The second big wave, which we've been riding for the last several decades, is sort of breakthrough drugs and devices. And this, in turn, is sort of, tamed diseases. It's wiped out diseases like polio, like smallpox, taken things like polio to the brink of extinction, taken something like HIV, which was a death sentence, and made it a manageable chronic disease. And now we're at the point where we are now sort of becoming victims of our own success. That the increases in longevity that some of these things have created are now creating an epidemic of chronic diseases that's threatening to undo all the progress we've made. And in some sense, the progress we've made has been what on paper sounds like the more difficult stuff. Like, can you figure out this really complex, AIDS virus and then figure out how it works and come up with a treatment regimen for it? If you think about that 30 years ago and think about, getting people to just, eat healthy and exercise more, which of those two sounds more difficult and which of those two actually turns out to be a lot more difficult, right? So we're now on the cusp of what will have to be the third big wave, which is behavioral change, and that's what it will take to really bring us the next big advance in health outcomes. And why is that? It's sort of the, the Willie Sutton principle. It's where the money is. So if you're, and I'm certainly preaching to the choir here, a lot of you in government sitting here in the room, governments across the world, certainly in the industrialized world, the common challenge, probably the biggest, if not one of the biggest common challenges, is budgets and fiscal issues and all of that, austerity, et cetera, et cetera. But underlying that really is the reality that it's not so much a budget problem, it's a healthcare problem. That, healthcare is the thing that's threatening to, if it is not brought under control, cannibalize everything else. It's rising faster than inflation in many markets, and unless we do something about it, that's what's going to undo us. And if we're able to solve that problem, by the way, there is no budget problem. It really is a healthcare problem. And peel that onion back one more layer, and again, numbers that many of you are familiar with. 75% of healthcare costs are chronic diseases. 50% of outcomes are not infections, are not genetics. It's behavior. So, and then you add to that what's happening to the world population over the next 4 decades, tripling the number of people over the age of 65. The biggest challenge, the biggest opportunity is behavioral change, and therefore, we don't even have a healthcare problem, we really have a behavior problem, right? So that's sort of the context, that's the big picture. What I think is particularly exciting about this point in time is that we are now on the cusp, well, not even on the cusp, we're starting to see 3 big trends that are coming together, and it's a remarkable coincidence that they're happening at the same time. They didn't have to happen at the same time, but they are, and in that, is a lot of potential. So the first of those trends is changing incentives, and what that means is, because of the big need to bring costs under control, what we're seeing across major markets is a move away from what people in the business tend to call fee-for-service, which is to say, pays people to do more stuff. So if you were a doctor, every time you did a surgery, you got paid. Every time you had a CAT scan on someone, ka-ching, you got paid. It was all pay people for the volume of activity. There was no consideration of, did that patient really need that CAT scan? Is that actually a better outcome for the system? People were just getting paid for the volume of activity they did. What's changing now is that's being flipped. And payers, whether it's governments, whether it's insurance companies, are looking at that and saying, no, we're not going to pay for activity, we're going to pay for value. So it's moving from fee for service towards pay for performance. And that in turn, it sounds like, again, blindingly obvious why I haven't been doing this all this while, but the fact that that's happening completely changes the incentives and completely changes the business that anybody in the healthcare business is in. You're now in a completely different business, right? So if you were, a lot of my clients are the pharma companies. If you were a pharma company, the business you were in was you got drugs approved. Once you got that drug approved, you had essentially a license to print money for many years. You had patent protection, and you could charge whatever the heck you wanted, and the market would take it, and every pill you sold, you got paid for, and you just made money doing it. And I mean, I'm simplifying it a little bit here. There's obviously a lot of R&D that goes into it. There's a lot of risk these companies take, and they're recouping that investment in this model, but that was the model, right? Now, you're in a world where you're not in the drug business, you're in the outcomes business, all right? So you are not getting paid for every pill you sell, you're getting paid for how much people respond to those pills. That's a very different business proposition. You are now in the business of improving health outcomes, therefore, you now have an economic incentive. Those perverse incentives that existed, and healthcare, by the way, was full of perverse incentives, that people had the incentive to just do more stuff, to just regardless of whether it was good for the patient or not. Now those incentives are flipped for pharma companies, for medtech companies, for doctors, for anybody in the healthcare business, right? That's one part of what's happening. The other part of what's happening is that, this is obviously, it's a big challenge. It's the $1 trillion challenge we face. That's bringing in a whole lot of other companies. So, Google takes a look at this and says, when I look at that healthcare challenge, that looks like a data issue to me, and there's a lot of value to be brought by big data and analytics, and we think we know something about that, so why don't we invest in it? And sure enough, Google is investing in it. GE looks at it and says, we look at this and think about this as an efficiency challenge, and we, GE, know a thing or two about efficiency, so they're investing $6 billion in something called Healthy Imagination, which is all about bringing new kinds of solutions to the market. So a lot of new kinds of companies coming in, and this business model for existing companies completely changing, and all of that means that business, which so far might have been part of the problem, is now really part of the solution, and there are lots of opportunities for government to be partnering differently. We talk in our thought leadership about radical collaboration, which is collaborating with very different kinds of entities. We're seeing lots of examples of that, and I can talk about that some more later. But a lot of opportunity to be tapping some of that, right? The second big trend is sort of these technologies that are coming of age, and I call them PI technologies. They're patient empowering information leveraging. It's everything from mobile, social media, but social media not just Facebook and Twitter, but also social media platforms that are connecting patients to each other, doctors to each other. So they're learning in real time. They're creating real time data, obviously, as are all these mobile apps that we all read about and use more and more. Sensors, the Internet of Things, all the stuff we read about is coming to healthcare big time. And in healthcare, by the way, this is a much bigger shift than it is in the rest of the economy, right? I mean, the healthcare is really stuck in the equivalent of the mainframe era, it's where computing was 70 years ago, that if you want some computing done, you had to go to the computing room, and you went with your punch card, and you came back 2 days later, and here was your answer. Healthcare so far has been in that world where you have to go to the doctor, who is the equivalent of the programmer. The doctor says, we're going to run some tests on you. You go back 2 days later, perhaps you learn what is or isn't wrong with you, then maybe you go somewhere else for some more follow-up. We're now moving to a world where all this information, all the power, just like in computing, it moved from the mainframe to the desktop, to the laptop, to the smartphone, to sensors. Healthcare is now leapfrogging all of that and putting that power almost overnight, relatively speaking, in the hands of the patient, in the hands of the consumer, empowering patients, and all of this obviously is creating data in real time. A lot of opportunity around data analytics and a lot of companies that are doing creative things around that too. Third big trend is behavioral economics. Obviously, I'm preaching to the choir on this one as well. Again, this is something that's been around in concept, since at least the 1970s, when Daniel Kahneman first started, doing this kind of work. It's only come into vogue and only taken off in a big way over the last decade. Again, that's a very happy coincidence because these three things, they all feed into each other. Any one of those things by themselves would not be enough, but the fact that they're all happening together means that they can reinforce each other mutually. So as the incentives are changing, behavioral economics can make sure those incentives that are changing aren't just the quote-unquote common sense, old way of thinking about carrots and sticks, but let's design those incentives to actually work. Similarly, these technologies, they're coming of age just at the right time because they are a very good way of actually tracking patient behavior, and we aren't just giving people incentives based on the honor code. We're actually able to see what they're doing. So we can talk about this, but there's a lot of positive feedback in the fact that these three things are happening at the same time. The last slide I'll close with is some examples, and I don't have a whole lot of time. So, the first three there, those are probably, we already talked a lot of discussion about Save More Tomorrow. The next two are sort of things that George Lowenstein has done, around adherence, which is a big problem in healthcare. But the bottom two, which is what I'll maybe spend a few minutes talking about, are examples of these approaches not being applied in academia, not being applied in government, but these approaches being applied by profit-making companies that are using behavioral economics not to exploit customer behavior so that they can just make more money, but using those incentives to get patients to do the right thing and making money doing that, by the way. So the first example out there is Gympact, and David Lipson, you talked yesterday about joining the gym, and I think you said it was $1,000 you and your wife paid, and you went, 4 times or 5 times and spent $200 a visit. Also coming out of your neck of the woods and coming out of Harvard is this startup called Gympact, which has since renamed itself to be just Pact. But it basically took the same incentives and said, let's flip them on their head and get people to actually use the gym. And by the way, this is not an isolated example, right? We all do this. The health club industry is based upon a model that has tons and tons of excess capacity. The average health club has 10 times as many members as they can physically fit in their facilities, and they do that because their cynical business model is based on the knowledge that most of us will never show up and never use the gym, right? So what did Gympact do? Gympact said, let's flip that model on its head, right? So the way it works is you make a pact, and you make the pact and say, okay, my pact is I'm going to go to the gym, and I can pick complete freedom. Again, principle that's come up again and again. No one's forcing you. You decide the pact. I'll say I'm going to go to the gym this week 3 times, and that pact to me is worth $10, $15, all right? If I go to the gym those 3 times in the following week, I get to keep the $15. And by the way, they're using my smartphone app to know when I actually go to the gym, so it's not just based upon me self-reporting. They actually know it. So if I go to the gym, I keep the $15, right? If I don't, I lose the $15. People who don't go to the gym, all their money gets forfeited, goes into a central pool. And the people who did go to the gym, they get to divvy up the money of the people who didn't go to the gym that week, all right? So it completely flips the model on its head. It's using loss aversion, which is a very powerful motivator because we hate to lose that money, and it's motivating us. It's taking hyperbolic time discounting, which is the fact that you don't like to go to the gym because it's pain today for a benefit that's yours out in the future. It's making that pain immediate. It's making it tangible. The fact that the gym sets it up so that it's a convenient automatic debit from your checking account is not a coincidence. They're doing that because the pin is invisible to you. You forget that you're even paying it. This makes it visible. Every week you're paying it. They're using status quo bias because you set up the pact, and the pact, if you don't change it, sort of carries forward. You can change it every weekend and say, this week I'm going to be traveling. I'm not going to use the pact this week, but more often than not, you don't. So it just carries on going forward. So very quickly, that's just one example. There are others. There are startups that are disrupting their space. There are large companies, the pharma companies I talk to, they're hiring behavioral scientists, they're looking into this. So business, that's sort of the message I want to bring here, is a part of the solution, at least in the healthcare space, and we should be thinking about it differently. So that's it, and I'll hand it over to you. Yeah.
Excellent. Another great addition to the story. It's getting better and better. So Jack, Dan, bring us home.
It happens far more often than you
That's all right.
Well, look, I'm the last one to speak today, and I'm kind of between this session and the next session that talks about the future of BI. So partly because of that, and partly because whenever I'm showing up at the conference, I either end up speaking about technology development and research, internet usage, smartphones, etc., or about government research in terms of public engagement with the government. I thought I'll try something slightly different today. And this is a bit of a surprise, probably even for the organizers. And some people are shaking now. And talk about, to quote, I think it was Cass Sustain yesterday, talk about water. And what I mean by that is talk about some of the things that surround us and affect us every day in our work life, in our personal life, affect our future. And sometimes are regarded as a bit out there, a bit not really affecting or impacting us immediately, until all of a sudden there is almost that effect of surprise. They are all here upon us. And in order to do that, I'm going to try and start with a little bit of anchoring. And because the presentation is called Thinking Ahead, obviously, the predictable question is, how many people have read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow? All right. Well, I've always had a very strong confirmation bias that I'm responsible for a significant amount of referrals and book sales, at least in Australia, because I always found it very, very easy to read and very easy to understand. So a strong suggestion and recommendations for those who haven't had an opportunity to read it before to do so. It's really, should I say life-changing? I can say life-changing. But basically, there are 2 points that I want to take out of Kahneman's book. The first one is that existence that was mentioned last night by Adam of 2 systems of thinking, one which is fast, emotional, subconscious, prone to error, but is ultimately, as a small piece of detail, responsible for our survival as a species, and that's system 1. And the other one, which is slow, deliberate, conscious, something that we probably would like to associate ourselves with, at least for every decision that we make, and that matters in somehow. So think of those 2 kind of systems as one anchor point. And the second one is one part of his prospect theory, which goes to say that people have a general tendency to consider things in isolation, to kind of ignore dependencies and relationships and focus on one thing at a time and try to deal with one problem or one decision and then move on to the next one, a bit of a serial process in that regard. So what I'm going to try in the next 12 minutes to do is to override a little bit of that system 1 by bringing up a whole set of topics and issues that I'm going to challenge and try and also help you make some relationships between. But more importantly, consider it as both as part of your everyday life as individuals, and more importantly, how they actually apply in your roles in government organizations. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion. Now, because we only have 11 minutes and 30 seconds left, there may be a little bit of cognitive overload. So if that happens, just I'll stop, and you make a note, and we'll come back to it during the discussions. So let's start with a little bit of framing, and I'm going to try to draw some new conclusions from some of the stereotypes or things that are out there and most of you know them through a particular lens. The first one is the notion of innovation, and innovation seems to be a very prevalent buzzword at the moment. Pretty much everyone is thinking more about innovation, trying to do more innovation. Sometimes we're ready to throw out everything and start from scratch. Some other times we're looking to tinkering around the edges. Have you ever thought about why innovation is so important nowadays? Well, in the private sector, it is a source of competitive advantage. So that's what makes market move. And it is based on the idea of kind of time-based competition, which means that we no longer look at, for example, experience curve effects. We no longer look at restructuring or portfolio management as management theories or approaches to competitive advantage. We look at what is the function of time and how that can give us an edge at a particular point. If you think for one cliche example, which is, for example, 3D printing and manufacturing, right? Most people have heard of 3D printing, have seen it work. It's kind of rudimentary, it's beginning. But yesterday, there was an article in the press about a Boston hospital who managed to 3D print blood vessels. So think about that and what's likely to happen in the next 5 to 10 years' time, and what are the implications for healthcare. Or think about, extrapolate it to a level of kind of a national economy, and think about competitive advantage in manufacturing and how that should be approached. And for some of us, that may not make much of a difference, but for some other people in this room, this actually goes back to the process of thinking about policies and systems that essentially will make this work or not work in the years ahead. Now, since I mentioned 3D printing of blood vessels, let's bring up another topic, which is brain plasticity. Now, over the recent years, science has successfully challenged the old notions that brain is a little bit of a kind of static, in a way, organ, and discovered that there is much more built-in flexibility and that the brain can transform itself both physically and chemically and functionally throughout the life, either as a result of learning processes or as a result of memory or as a result of medical conditions. Now, if we are to think about developments in that space, that kind of challenge existing biological limitations in one way or another, what are the implications of that, for example, for healthcare, something that was covered before, for the quality of life, especially as people tend to have a longer life expectancy, and even for the insurance companies, right? And rehabilitation exercises and regimes. And what is it likely to mean for us going forward? Again, quite a number of different areas that are out there, probably a little bit on the fringe, but not necessarily mainstream yet. One thing that is definitely mainstream is technology. So if we look back about 20 years when the internet started being commercialized, that kind of spurred a whole set of growth, connections, relationships, and essentially more interaction across the world. About 8 years ago, I think it was when the first iPhone started, and last year, some of our research showed that internet is now used, at least in Australia, more from mobile platforms than from fixed platforms. Siemens, which is a company that does a lot of interesting research, are predicting that in the next 20 years, the power of technology will increase 1,000 times. So think about the sort of things, we're talking about today about the fact that analytical, big data, cloud, there are trends here, but we still have some challenges in terms of collecting data points, analyzing them, and so on. What would we be able to do, not with 1,000-time increase in computing power and storage availability and so on, but only with 100 times increase? And that is likely to be upon us much sooner than we expected. So again, when we start thinking about the policy development process and about the service delivery, let's not consider only the parameters of today's world, but let's consider that of tomorrow and the day after, and that one, that of the world in which our children and their children are going to grow up, and we're going to grow old. Let's move now to some of the biases. What's interesting is that we have, as human beings, a tendency to do things in a particular way. And probably that is most obvious in the case of communication. And I'm saying that with a full knowledge of having one of my degrees in linguistics. So issues such as agency bias and identity of parties and message and intentions and meaning have evolved significantly over the last, let's say, 60 or 70 years. I remember the great pleasure I had in discovering the rigor of structuralism in linguistics, which essentially put everything nice in a box. You have one party communicating, you have the other party communicating, you have the message, you have the channel of communications. But then pragmatics came along and said, wait a second, the context is everything, and the intention between the meaning, between the conveyance of meaning is slightly different, or maybe slightly different from that of one party speaking to the other party hearing it. And I think what we've seen more recently is a lot of more rich understanding of that communication, and even the implications of that for things such as confirmation bias or bandwagon effect, or all set of cognitive biases that are perpetuated, exploited, and transmitted through the act of communication. Now, another thing that's interesting is the notion of trust. Obviously, as more people have the ability to link with each other and find new ways of interacting, the issue of trust becomes more and more prevalent. And whether, for example, let's say, 50 years ago, you had to go to a shop and talk to a salesperson in order to get some information about a product or about a service, and you had an implicit need to trust that person, or to trust that at least some of the things that that person is saying are relevant and correct, and somehow, God help us, good enough for us to actually make a decision. Right now, there are so many more communications channels and vetting channels for the information exchange that the issue of trust is quite diminished, and it's not as critical for each individual party of the exchange. What I mean by that is that, for example, we take government to be considered as a very trustworthy and trusted market sector or economy sector. And I choose those words deliberately. But by the same token, we have a somewhat implicit assumption that that will always be the case. Well, if we look in the private sector, we'll see that the erosion of the relationship of trust and the importance of trust with one particular party, which is the supplier of goods or the provider of services, has been accelerated by the availability of additional channels and additional parties that take on that role. And I wouldn't venture to say that the government will always be safe in that regard. Sorry, I'll just keep going. And probably one of the interesting things to see this is in the case of privacy. I was lucky enough to be invited to speak at an event during the Privacy Week a couple of weeks ago, or about a month ago, whatever it was. And one of the people that spoke before me said, look, we have very reliable data to show that 90% of Australians are really concerned about sharing their information, and especially if they go offshore, if that information goes offshore. And sure enough, we are an Australian company, and it would be a beneficial argument for us to consider that, because it's part of our market advantage. But by the same token, research we have conducted shows a totally different picture, and that is that people are happy, for example, to share more information with the government if that information is used to be making their life easier. And we have been talking for a while now, and I think I was in the data session yesterday with Tam Shepard, who said that he has a hunch that users of government services are more willing to share their information across multiple agencies, kind of tell us once approach. And we actually have the data to confirm that. But on the other hand, there is always that issue of trade-off versus payoff in the case of privacy. So people, on one hand, say that personal information is very important. On the other hand, they're willing to give it away for a sticker, a freebie, a bar of chocolate, or something like that. And I'm going to run out of time. So what I'm going to do is kind of skip through some of these things. A couple of minutes. So how do you explain some of those discrepancies, and what do you do about it? One of the interesting things, again, that is somewhat at the fringes is the notion of mapping, both mapping cognitive representations, whether it's concepts, objects, categories, and so on, so kind of how people and the brain organizes the world, and then how those maps differ depending on different contexts. And the notion of cognitive maps has been around for a number of years. The notion of mattering maps, again, has been around for about 20 or so years. And that goes to the point that a people's perception can be represented not as an index, because more than one thing matters at one point in time, but as a map, and there are relationships between those things that matter, and they will vary depending on the context. But finally, what I want to bring it together is that notion that, as we talked earlier, the technology will make it more and more easy to, on one hand, create virtual environments where most of these representations can be tested, whether it is almost a virtual random time-controlled trials, or whether it is geometrical representations for the purpose of artificial intelligence. But those things which happen right now, and there are lots of smart people working on it, which are going to become mainstream much sooner than we think. And finally, I'll end with a kind of a wrapper around the cognitive tools. So over the last couple of days, we talked a lot about behavioral insights, behavioral economics, and some of the tools that are available for us, and some of the biases and some of the predispositions that we have. What's interesting about the notion of behavioral insights itself is the fact that it is a result of a convergence of a number of different fields, whether it is psychology, whether it's cognitive science, whether it is brain sciences, and so on and so forth. And I remember probably, I think I said last night, about 10 years ago when I finished my PhD thesis in relevance. One of the interesting things and one of the interesting dilemmas I had was that I was trying to bring a whole set of disparate domains in one thesis that would make sense. And while that thesis did make sense, because obviously someone managed to get me a degree, or to award me a degree, the most challenging part of it was finding people that had enough of a broad knowledge of those domains in order to be able to evaluate the thesis. And I think that was a challenge 10 years ago. Probably less of a challenge today, as we see more and more collaboration across different domains and different sciences, and probably more convergence towards a more unified approach to behavior, to people, and to their tendencies. And what we're likely to see is that much like the behavioral insights unit have developed the Bandscape, the Mindscape. We are likely to see more rigor as a result of this test, more rigor being applied and new frameworks and new categories being developed that will make it easier for us to actually apply those in our day-to-day job. And finally, the final point about the role of technology in all of this. Whether we like it or not, whether we resist it or not, technology is evolving at an increasingly accelerated pace. And I cannot stress enough the importance of that, not only for our day jobs today, but more importantly for the way we approach our jobs tomorrow. That's it.
Thank you, Jack.
Terrific. Okay. We have about 20-odd minutes for some questions. I'm going to throw a couple quickly to the whole panel, so get warmed up. And Alex is already waving at me, so Twitter must be working, so that's good, and I'm remembering to look at him a little earlier this time, so that's great. We may even start there, but I'll be looking for hands in a moment. But I'm going to just throw a couple of general questions, and I'll start with Mike and then open it up for the rest of the panel. If the game increasingly is that business is in the outcomes business, not in the business they thought they were in, that seems to me to be a very fertile place to start to talk to them about behavioural insights, because it'll help them to some extent make that shift. I guess I'm interested in your sense as to how prevalent that is and how easy that is to get business to understand that that's now the environment they're in, and that therefore they need, if I might say so, people like you, or the analysis and skills of people like you to help them make that transition. And I'll ask the other folks to talk about their own particular businesses in that regard, but what's your general sense about that?
Are you saying people like me because you don't think I can do it? Is that?
Well,
that
wasn't a bit. You can tell he's got an English literature background. No, you could even probably do it yourself, I suspect. But yes, people as good as you and even others.
It's highly variable is the short answer to that. Right. So I think there's certainly always a risk that you waltz into a company and say, you've been doing everything wrong the entire time. And the members of the company say, we've been a successful organization for 100 years, so what are you talking about? So I think some of the things that we have to offer are very useful, and some are perhaps less useful, but there's enormous heterogeneity in organizations' willingness to take these things on. I will say that in terms of incorporating the insights, I think that there is increasingly, if you look at age in corporations and willingness to try these things, like with all new ideas, younger people tend to be more excited about it. In terms of understanding and wanting to implement the insights, I think there is often a willingness there. In terms of some of the gold standard things that we've been talking about, which are randomized controlled trials, there's much less willingness to implement those, sometimes for very, very good reasons. For example, we don't give our employees different incentives at the same time, which is a perfectly legitimate pushback to tell us no. And then sometimes it's less legitimate. Basically, we don't do that because we don't know how to send out emails, 2 different emails at the same time. And that's a huge barrier to most of the research that we do. So, but even in the last couple of years, there's been an enormous growth, especially because a lot of the companies that are known for doing experimentation turn out to be like extremely successful. For example, Facebook and Google are always touting the fact that they experiment all the time. Amazon experiments all the time, but they're a little bit quieter about it. But very, very, when top of class corporations are hiring people who are engaged in this kind of activity, the market tends to listen.
Yeah, Richard Thaler mentioned a couple of those too. So given that we mentioned Facebook, any reflections from you about?
No, I think from our perspective, I think it's mainly just being focused on outcome and never being too invested in a process. Because if the process is a sort of a hacker culture of always questioning and always improving, then you don't get too invested so that you kind of lose the sense of the outcome.
Okay, all right. Any other reflections on the way in which we can get people? I mean, you talked a lot about, we're in the outcome. How easy is that conversation to have, or is it getting easier?
Yes to both of those things. So I think it varies, from company to company. I will say healthcare, I think, is a bit of a special case, and I think the fact that healthcare itself is being fundamentally realigned creates sort of an urgency for change and a case for change that probably isn't there in a lot of other industries. That being said, especially for the large, mature incumbents, you look at Clayton Christensen's work, you look at sort of the history of business disruption across the economy, across history. Large companies have a very hard time disrupting themselves, and there are behavioral biases at work that prevent them from taking on some of those things. Very often you're sort of comparing yourself to the wrong baseline and saying, well, this new thing, our existing thing looks pretty profitable. Why would we invest in this new thing? Instead of comparing yourself to the baseline you should be comparing yourself to, which is the world as it's going to exist in the future, as opposed to the world you've always known. So, so it sort of varies from company to company, I'd say. Yeah.
And talking of mature incumbents, the Telstra story, easy conversation to have?
Well, it is a complex conversation to have, but we're doing it more and more. So yes, we are an incumbent, and many people do have a particular view of Telstra. But probably about 3 or 4 years ago, we have started a significant journey of transformation. And one of my colleagues here today, Bram, is from the business unit called Telstra Digital, which is actually leading that charge. But I think one of the things that significant or quite big incumbents have a challenge with is challenging some of the existing perceptions in the customer base or in the world at large. So Telstra as a brand is a very well-recognized brand, but by the same token, that means that people have certain perception of that brand and what the company as a business is doing. And it's probably mostly about, an internet provider or a mobile phone provider. I don't know how many people in this room, for example, know that Telstra is probably the third largest media company in the country. Probably not many. Or let's say, I think it's the 8th or 9th largest telecommunications company in the world. Again, it's not something that comes across particular segments of our population or of our customer base, because we have been engaging with them in a particular way through a particular channel.
Okay, cool. All right, we're going to start taking some questions, and I'm going to go straight to Twitter because the hand was up early. So if someone can just lift the house lights a little bit, there we go. I'll start seeing other hands too. So get your questions ready. Alex, it's all yours.
Yeah, so lots of questions on Twitter. Sorry, Maya, it's not through Facebook. But one of the big questions that came up at the beginning is whether, Mike, your results would lend credit to the hypothecation of taxes and its collection. Particularly, there was a question around junk food taxes. So if
around which? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Junk food taxes.
Oh, right.
So how would we then measure the impact of that? And how do we really measure the impact of those sort of interventions across a whole society?
So let me say, when we've talked to people in government all the way from national level to state level to local level to small towns, hypothecation is usually not everyone's favorite word, let's say, for the fear that if people can decide where their taxes go, again, you won't be able to build roads and have clean water and things like that, because people will want their taxes to go to all sorts of random things. Again, we don't tend to see that. So when we look in the data, it is true that people don't absolutely agree with where their taxes go now, but because different people disagree in different ways, the net is often not that far from where things are right now. So people on one side of the spectrum want to defund X and give more to Y, but people on the other side of the spectrum want to do the exact opposite, and you actually tend to see some changes, but not huge changes overall. In terms of getting people to be more accepting of new taxes, for example, if there were a junk food tax or any other kind of tax, a gasoline tax that's more tied to the environment and things like that, we haven't done the research yet. But my guess is, again, imagine your taxes go up on product X that you like, and those taxes can either be allocated towards something you care about or stolen by the government, and you never know what happens to them. Will anybody like higher taxes? No, we don't see that anybody ever wants higher taxes. Will they be relatively happier with the tax? My guess is yes, if, again, they can say, these taxes are going towards something I care about.
Okay, cool. We've got a hand up already over here, so we'll do that, and then we might come back to Alex later, so don't go away for very far. Wave your arms if you need a question. Please stand up and so we can see you. Thanks.
Hi. I'd just like to ask two simple questions, related questions. The first one, is there a moral distinction between the government nudging citizens to pay taxes promptly and big business using nudges to make consumers buy the next pair of sneakers? And following that, should BI and the trials that is done by big business be in some sense registered or made publicly known or regulated? Thank you.
Cool. I'm not going to say a single word. I'd quite like to say something. Yeah, please go right ahead.
I don't necessarily. So, the big, bad private sector have been nudging, as people have said, have been nudging the population or the consumers for ages now, right? It's called advertising industry. It's well established. And I think, I may have mentioned that last night, that the Journal of Consumer Research is going strong since 1974. And it's quite an interesting read, I must say. Everything from the 4.99, the effect of 0.99 versus round pricing, to the role of celebrity endorsements and so on and so forth. What I think that the distinction is between advertising and nudging in a kind of public policy sense is the fact that there is probably now more of a realization that those tools that have been used and proven, I might say, quite successfully in the private sector through the advertising industry, may actually be useful in the toolkit of the government in order to affect the outcomes that they're seeking through policy development. So essentially, I don't think anyone is arguing that that government should be nudging people more just because they feel like. I think what everyone is saying is that the government should be considering the tools available as part of behavioral insights in the context of the larger policy options and tools in their toolkit, whether it's mandating, whether it's legislation, whether it is regulation, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go.
In terms of the transparency point, I mean, companies like ours are always transparent about that. I mean, user trust is the cornerstone of our business. So if we're not transparent and people don't know, then they're going to stop trusting us and stop engaging via our platforms. So, I'm on the panel. We have a data science Facebook page, which I encourage everyone to check out. We just open source the entire A/B tool kit. In terms of whether regulation is appropriate, I mean, I think regulation, particularly in areas like technology, it is inflexible, it is clunky, it just doesn't stand the iterative test. I think collaboration between government, between researchers and the private sector produce the best results because people can move nimbly and everyone can listen into feedback.
Any other observations?
So it's a fantastic question, and I think my colleague at Harvard, Todd Rogers, has a distinction that I think is really, really useful, which is think about nudges that are a person has expressed that they would like to do X, and they're not doing X. And we can help them do X. And that could be anything. It could be weight loss. It could be spending more time with their kids. It could be whatever they want to do. I think most people are on the morality end of the distribution saying, those nudges seem okay because people have specifically said, I'd like to do X, will you help me? And we're saying, yes, here are some tools to try to help you. It's unclear where government and corporations fall on that line. So there's a tendency to think that government's closer to that than corporations. In some domains, probably yes. In some domains, probably no. So no one is saying, will you please help me pay more taxes? And the government is helping them to do that. But we have a belief that that's this kind of a civic behavior that is moral in a sense, whereas maybe some other consumer behaviors are not. So I'm not exactly sure where the line falls there in terms of the moral thing. I think we're comfortable when people want to do it, they should do it. At the same time, if someone says, even on this end of it, this is the problem, if someone says, I would really like to smoke more cigarettes, well, we could design amazing interventions to help them. We'd be really, really good at it and help them meet their goal, and yet we probably wouldn't think that was moral, even though that's a desire of theirs that they've told us. So it's a very thorny issue, really, that I think we're only beginning, because we're so early in having successful interventions that work, we're early in the process of when are these kind of ethical and when are we maybe getting closer to a line that we're not comfortable with. And I think we need to think a lot more about it.
That opens up a big territory. Did you want to make any final comment?
I think
the transparency issue versus regulation, for example?
I think a lot of this gets into issues of social justice, and philosophy almost. What you're talking about is, doing something that's and nudging people to do something that's right for society, how does that get defined versus, giving them the freedom to do whatever they want, and you can argue that both of those things are unjust or unfair in different ways, and some of these things I think we have to sort of decide as a society, but it's really a social justice issue.
Sure. Okay, I've got a hand right here in the middle, and now he's got a microphone, even better.
That was quick, thank you. There have been a number of very strong points made about the joy of giving, particularly Mike in this session, a lot of very good examples. Are there any data on unpacking potentially two key components of that, which is the actual giving versus the act of being acknowledged and having been given? In other words, anonymous giving versus anonymous giving? Any data at all?
Yes, so we've done, so the question is, if you think about what kind of giving makes you happier, is it the kind where you give anonymously and the recipient will never know, and no one else will ever know that you gave? Many world religions have some form that is the highest form of giving. Or does it make you happier to give and you stand on a stage and everyone claps for you? How many people think giving anonymously makes you happier? How many people think people applauding and saying you're great makes you happier? Yeah, usually it's around 50-50. And you can think of great reasons why. So anonymous is good because it's real giving. It's more moral in a sense. The other kind is great because isn't it awesome when people clap for you? This joke I always make is there are no buildings at Harvard called the Anonymous Building. Tend to have names on them. Sadly, it turns out that giving with credit, sadly for some of you, giving with credit makes you happier than giving anonymously. However, giving anonymously compared to business as usual, spending on yourself, dominates. So spending on yourself doesn't do much for you. I'm making these numbers up now with my hands, but anonymous is here and social approval is here. But both of them very much trump anything that you'd be doing for yourself with your money.
I guess we should have given that second group a round of applause or something, should we?
That's exactly right.
But we're not going to, so don't encourage them. Alex, have we got another question? I'm still looking for hands, although we're running a little tight, but if there's a couple of other questions, let me know. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so this question that I think has come up throughout the conference,
Yeah.
but it is, if we keep using these techniques, and I guess particularly in the business world, then is there a risk of there being a desensitization over time?
So you can over-nudge, maybe to the point where people just don't get it. Any comments? Yeah, feel free to chip in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's particularly for healthcare, that's a huge challenge because you've got, chronic diseases that are going to play out over decades. So, and the best RCTs don't have evidence over that time frame. So I think it's a very real issue. I think there was a point made earlier in the conference that different kinds of nudges have different kinds of stickiness.
Yeah.
And I think some of the examples we've seen in healthcare, where you could think about things that are a little bit more gimmicky, they're lottery-based incentives. I question whether those have a lasting effect. I think ultimately you have to tap into something that gets to the psychology of it, that makes people feel good, and that's what ultimately, intuitively to me, seems like would have a more lasting impact. But yeah,
Any other thoughts? Can we nudge people till they're numb? Can we overdo it? I'm just asking the general. Anyone else who wants to go right ahead.
If you think about Cass Sunstein says this better than anyone, but everything in the world is a nudge. The way the tables are set up are making everyone at these tables, you say hi to the people at the table for some reason, but if we just had rows of chairs, you wouldn't say hi to the people who were just as close to you because they're not at your table. Everything the way it's set up is a nudge, and they do wear off over time. And the question is, just like everything in the world, what is the next nudge that you do? If every single thing you read says, did you know that 71% of people engage in this behavior, and it's across every single behavior in your life, of course that will stop having any impact on you. Just like in marketing, if everyone's making funny ads, then funny ads stop working as well, and then we get ads that are very tranquil, and then everyone makes a tranquil ad, and then people start making funny ads again. You can see these things happening cyclically. Same with fashion. You have to have a beard, and then later a beard is for losers, and then later a beard is cool again. This is the way it works. And what we're trying to do with nudges is, in a sense, say one step ahead of business as usual, and one step ahead of you. So what is the nudge that's going to work for you right now if the other ones are wearing off?
I guess we'll assume beards are cool at the moment, so that's cool.
As soon as a Harvard professor has a beard, not cool.
Is that right?
Yep, that's the definition.
Please everybody write that down. You'll be way ahead of the next wave. I can't see the hand. Where is it? Oh, there you are. Beg your pardon. Yeah, just keep talking. They'll switch you on.
Another one from Mike. Love all the stuff about what makes people happy and what doesn't, and spending money on others, and the new car on the new house and doesn't make you happy. And
is this a butt coming up?
how are you measuring happiness? What's the unit of happiness? And if it's self-report, why is it reliable in ways that other self-reports aren't?
So very, very important question, because one of the things about the time one nudge is if you do a behavior, it's done. I can measure it. If you voted, if you exercised, I know exactly if you did it, and it's objective. Some of these happiness kinds of things are obviously, by their very nature, much more subjective. So a question is, should we take them as seriously? We measure happiness in all kinds of ways, and some of them may seem ridiculous. So let me make up a scale that you've definitely never used. So on a scale from 1 to 73, where 1 is I'm as unhappy as I've ever been, and 73 is I'm as happy as I've ever been, where are you on the scale? Just think in your mind. Most of you, what would be the math? Most of you are probably like between 58 and 65 or something like that, which is what most people kind of feel. And it came to you like that, probably. Never heard the scale before. Huge thing I'm asking you. How happy are you with your life overall? Boom, 58. Popped into your head. And in a sense, that kind of makes it trivial. So how could that mean anything? If you really wanted to figure out your well-being, it should take you a week. You know, how's everything going, and let me get a big equation. But we have this sense in our minds of how well we're doing in our lives. And the important thing is, if I ask you again in a year, if you said 58 right now, you're probably still at 58. And if something bad happened during that year, you're probably lower. And if something good happened, you're probably higher. If you had a health problem, you're probably lower. If something good happened in your life, it probably went up. Now, I don't know if your 58 means the same thing at all as her 58. I have no idea. But I know that for you, that measure is very, very important for your overall assessment of your life. And it correlates with the kind of objective things that we care about. And as a result, even though they're kind of warm and fuzzy and not perfect, we can use them. So we can understand if people are here and we try thing X versus thing Y, and these people go down and these people go up, it's meaningful. And we can show also that those changes then predict future behavior, such that we know that the change in your mind is going to influence your change in behavior. So we're always looking for the way we can assess how happy you are and then use that to see if we can predict what you do going forward. For some audiences, how you're feeling is interesting and sufficient. For others, the behavior is the only thing that's kind of important and relevant. I think it's both together that really is the best way to understand what motivates people.
I suspect that question's a 2-day conference, possibly on its own. So we'll park that one for the next time. We've got one hand up there, and then we'll take this as the last question, and then we'll wrap up before tea. Could you please stand up so that people can see you, and also the camera can see you, which is even more important.
The frame of reference for my question comes from, I work in the area of public health behaviour change, but it can be much broader than that. The accepted wisdom over the last couple of days seems to be that giving people information is not enough to change their behaviour, and that nudging is about helping people get to where they want to go, or they've elected that they want to go. So should we still be in the business of driving demand for nudges and creating demand?
Just say that again. I'm not sure.
Should we still be working in the area of creating demand for appropriate social nudges? Should we be giving people the reason to contemplate change, or are we just going to wait until they put their hand up and want to change?
Oh, I see. So do we wait, or do we push it? Push-pull. Start anywhere we like.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, it's in the water. Nudges are all around us, and there's no getting away from them. And in health, your premium, everything is a nudge. And I agree, information is not the answer. Just giving people more information is not enough of an answer. So I think, if this is an urgent social challenge we face, and we do, I think as a society we could probably vote on it if we needed to, but that's to me, my answer is yes, we should be nudging them.
Yeah. I'm just going to throw one other, because I'm going to wrap at this point, because I think we need to have a final caffeine break before the big finale, as it were, and our focus on the future. Well, I'm just going to pick up a point Mike made earlier in answer to one of my questions, that, in terms of how this is evolving, it's patchy, but it's shifting in terms of the take-up by business of this conversation and so on. So if I could just a fairly brief response, just some sense over the next, 2 to 5 years, what kind of evidence would you expect to see that it's becoming less patchy and more consistent as business takes on? Like, is it the hiring of more behavioural economists, or is it something they do differently with their investment? What are we expecting business to be doing that we might notice that says, oh, gee, this thing is really becoming more consistent and less patchy? So that's just a very quick. If you don't want to answer, that's fine. I'm just interested if you've got a sense about where this might be heading in the next little while.
It's an interesting question. Because that makes an assumption that in order for business to be doing something more in this space, first of all, there will be some very strong signals in that regard. And I must say that probably for a whole set of businesses, they would either take the view, and I'm talking about businesses as opposed to government organizations, they would either take the view that they've been doing it for a while through their marketing departments and advertising departments, or they may take the view that their customers may not necessarily be, very happy to be nudged in a particular direction. So I'm not entirely sure that you'd actually see lots of businesses putting strong signals that they're embracing behavioral insight.
Gautam, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think, again, coming back to healthcare, what we're already starting to see is companies describing themselves as being in the health outcomes business. We're seeing a few of them do that. I think over the next, what was the time frame you said? Decade?
I said 2 to 5 years, which is a very, very scientific number that I picked out.
Yeah, so, well, okay, in that time frame, maybe not
You can
so
take
much,
longer,
but maybe a slightly longer time frame. I think you will see much more of that. You will see companies not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, moving beyond the narrow silo of healthcare where they've been focused, and looking more comprehensively at prevention, looking at disease management, looking at the entire patient journey and owning that and doing the right thing for the patient. And if they are really doing that, which they will need to do to be successful in the new health, if they are truly doing that, they will have to embrace behavioral economics, because that is the best way to change patient behavior, and that is, that's the 75% of healthcare costs right there. So.
Any final reflections on this side of the house? Go right ahead.
Sort of just-in-time, in-context notifications or options to make decisions. So, whether it's a little button on election day, or whether it's information about why you're seeing a particular ad, or information about how you can control the privacy of the information that you're sharing online. I think just having those in-context, real-time options really lets people be in control. The second, I think, is getting more feedback. So, I love it now. Every time I'm sort of using any kind of service, I'm getting feedback forms, and I love giving feedback. And then the third one is more and more companies and organisations describing themselves as data mongers. So looking at what people are doing when given just-in-time, in-context notifications, and what kind of feedback in terms of how they're thinking and feeling about that, and then putting that all together so that you're looking at what the data is telling you and iterating based on that.
Great. Mike, any final reflections? What evidence we might be seeing?
I think I would just say follow the money. So I think you look at the number of governments that have or are setting up nudge units, not just at a national level, but at a local level. In the U.S., many state governments are setting up units of some kind that use behavioral insights in one way or another. And I think companies are beginning to have groups that are called, the names are all over the place, but they're focused on some of these insights. And I think actually the biggest change is, because consultants kind of rule the world, boutique consulting firms that do this. And there are some now, but there are very few. And the larger consulting firms are building this in as one of the options in their suite of services. And that's where all of the cash in the world is. And the more that we see that happening, the more it'll be very, very clear that there's been buy-in across every industry.
So look for the consulting index, as it were. I've seen a few faces, people I happen to know are consultants, just smiling at that point, which is kind of nice. So we've made them happy. So 2 things I've learned this afternoon. I hope you've learned an enormous amount, as always with these sessions. Very rich, complex, simple, confusing, clear. It's really brilliant conversation. But 2 important things I've learned is that beards are on their way out, and Douglas Adams was wrong. It's not 42, the number is 58. Can you please thank Mike, Mia, Gautam and Jack very much for a great session.